Hey folks, I'm back with the round 3 recap of the 2020 FIDE Candidates. Obviously the big game of the day is Ding Liren scoring his first win against none other than Fabiano Caruana, who people were already starting to crown as the champion after a solid start, and with Ding doing so poorly in the first 2 rounds. But obviously he blew it wide open today. Now after 3 rounds there's 3 leaders with 2 at F3, MVL, Nepo and Wang Hao. The other 3 games of the day all finished in draws. Giri drew MVL, Grischuk drew against Wang Hao despite having some chances, and Alexeyenko and Nepo had a really interesting game. They traded some chances back and forth, but ultimately ended in a draw too. So although Ding Liren is still tied for 6th through 8th place with just 1 point out of 3 and -1, with so many rounds to go, and his win today probably being a huge boost of confidence, it's definitely way too early to count him out, and I think as far as anyone's concerned, he's still completely in it and so much more tournament to go that he can easily catch up in the remaining 11 rounds. So going into the marquee game of the round, Ding Liren playing white, Fabi playing the Slav, which is not something he usually uses as black. He was playing a lot of Queen's Gambit declined, especially against Magnus in the World Championship match. He's also been a Grunfeld player in the past. But the Slav is something that I would imagine Ding wasn't expecting for this game. And of course the big moment came on move 9. These guys played a pretty sharp and theoretical line: bishop d4, knight takes c4, castles king f2. This has been the trendy move over the last couple of years. And in this position, white is basically just trying to build a strong center with this move e4. The immediate e4 in this position is not considered so good, as black has this resource to play knight takes e4, f takes e4, and queen h4 check. Or king e2 is not good because of bishop g4. White has to play king d2, and after queen takes e4, we have a total mess on the board that is supposed to be just fine for black. So instead, Ding Liren plays king f2 here, and here the main moves have been c5 and bishop g6 by far. But Fabi plays a new move as early as move 9, which for the elite level is pretty serious, and an extremely sharp move in this move, e5. So this of course was a huge novelty because it turns the position into a complete mess. Ding Liren started spending tons and tons of time here and was down over an hour on the clock by move 17. He actually played very well in this stage of the game. He decided to take with the knight. This is not an only move, but I'll save the analysis for other people to do this deep opening analysis. I'm sure this will be the subject of some articles, perhaps in the next New in Chess yearbook. Here black played bishop c2. The point is queen takes c2 is met with queen takes d4 check, followed by picking up this knight on e5, where white's king is going to be very unsafe. Queen d2 was played. Black pushed c5, and now Ding takes space with d5. Definitely one of the more ambitious moves in the position. So Fabi kept blitzing his moves out for quite some time. Rook e8, queen f4, and Ding was of course trying to spend lots and lots of time here to figure out what to do and make sure he doesn't run into any kind of tactical shots. This is always a very tough situation for any kind of chess player, because you know that the position is supposed to be good for white. You've checked it with the engine. You know that the engine does not suggest the move e5, but all of a sudden you have one of the strongest players in the world playing it against you, blitzing his moves out, and you know he has some very, very deep preparation here. So really a tough situation for Ding Liren, especially given his confidence was probably quite low from the first 2 rounds, and a very risky choice by Caruana to go into this line. And ultimately the risk doesn't pan out for Fabi. He plays c4, sacrificing another pawn in order to open up this diagonal for the bishop. Knight takes c4, knight d7, bishop e3, knight f8, bishop d4, and somewhere around here, Fabi still had an hour and 40 minutes on his clock, basically more time than he started with. Ding was down to, I think, something like 25 minutes, and things were looking very, very difficult. I mean, the engine was showing that white has a pretty serious advantage here, 2 pawns, but to any human, the position looks extremely messy, and there's clearly tons of counterplay in the position for black. Not to mention the time situation is pretty serious. Even if you have a good position with white, it doesn't matter how strong you are, you're going to play worse in time trouble. Now, somewhere around here, it does seem like Fabi kind of mixed up his preparation. Maybe he played the wrong move, maybe he forgot what exactly he needed to do and decided to just kind of play quickly and bluff it, because white does end up getting a pretty serious advantage after knight to g6. The engine was shouting the move queen to c1 and giving something like +2 to white. Now there's a lot of sharp lines here, and it seems very, very tricky. Again, it's not clear whether Fabiano went for this position on purpose just to take a huge risk and put pressure on his opponent, or if he simply just mixed up or forgot his prep, because of course from Black's point of view there were so many moves leading up to this point that he had to have checked, and his team obviously works very hard. He works very hard on having a very sharp preparation. And sometimes it happens and you get to the board, you just don't exactly remember what you looked at or what the engine showed. All of the positions kind of blend in together. I'm sure it happens to even the world's best players. Now, for a full breakdown of this game, I would encourage you guys to check out Grandmaster Jesse Krai's Move of the Day videos that he's doing for this channel. These have been really, really interesting and instructive so far. And he takes a very deep and psychological look at this move e5, which really just threw the game into complete turmoil and was a huge risk that ultimately didn't pan out for Fabi. After knight g6, queen f5, somewhere around here, Fabi started spending a little bit of time indicating that he very much was out of prep and had to think for himself, and his position quickly ran out of steam. The engine showed some opportunities for Black to create some play here. White's move queen f5, I should note, was not the computer's top choice, and this ultimately gives Black a lot of opportunities, but ultimately he ends up missing them. He goes bishop c5 here, bishop takes c5, and here the engine is just shouting for the move rook to e5. Now, based on the game, Fabi spent around 14 minutes on this move, which was quite interesting. He played this move bishop c5 quite quickly. White captured on c5, and now instead of recapturing queen takes c5 check, he spends 14 minutes and then ends up doing this anyway. So clearly he was calculating something here. A human look at the position doesn't suggest any moves other than rook e5. It's not clear what exactly he didn't like about this position, or maybe he miscalculated something, but he ends up playing queen takes c5, king f1, and h6, basically staying 2 pawns down, and ultimately didn't get enough compensation to show for it. Rook d1, queen b6. I think this was maybe the last moment where, had he played a6, he could have created a little bit more counterplay in the position, threatening these moves b5 as well as queen b4, and just trying to open things up on the queen side and create more play for his pieces. And this is always one of the big risks of going for such sharp preparation. In my previous video for round 2, I kind of praised Caruana for his fantastic preparation and his ability to put his opponents under very serious pressure, where they know they're dealing with some powerful engines, Stockfish, Leela 0, and they're not quite sure what to do, what the best way is, and a lot of times even the world's best players will crack under this pressure, start playing poorly, and end up getting punished for it. But there is also risk for the other side. Number one, if you mix up your preparation, you could just end up 2 pawns down for nothing. Ding Liren is obviously a super strong player, 2800, and if you give him a position where he's 2 pawns up, he understands that, okay, even though his opponent is prepared, sometimes people mess up and they get into a bad position, and he's going to have no issues just trying to convert and punish him, as has happened in this game. But the other risk is that you might get a situation that the engine is actually evaluated as good for you, but then over the board you're not able to figure out what exactly the engine had in mind when it was calculating this position. So you know it's supposed to be 0.2, and Black is 2 pawns down but has tons of compensation, but you don't know exactly how to get that compensation or what the precise resources are, and so you might end up playing badly. I think this is what happened to Anish Giri in round 1 against Nepo, where he clearly came with a very deep and very interesting idea, but at some point he was out of book and his play was not as strong as, of course, what the engine probably was suggesting at home. And this is likely what happens to Caruana, maybe a mix of both. Maybe he forgot his prep and thought he had something that he didn't, but eventually just ends up in a very bad position, where even though White's king here is still on f1 and in some danger, if Black isn't able to create enough counterplay in time, then White just has these 2 massive pawns in the center and a completely winning position. So Ding Liren plays a fantastic game here, eventually gets out. b4, knight d1, queen b3, rook d2. It gives back one pawn on a4, which is totally irrelevant to the position, but is eventually able to actually get his king into safety. And once white's pieces come out, the two pawns in the center are too strong, and Ding ended up winning this game and really bouncing back in the tournament in quite a fantastic way. So even though he was way down on the clock, he realized he has a good position, and he's such a strong player that he was able to just kind of play this position out in time trouble, not give his opponent any chances. Fabiano, of course, tried to stir up some more counterplay, but couldn't really create enough counterplay to muddy the waters enough for Ding Liren to mess up, and Ding went on to win a really big game. Like I mentioned, the other three games in this round were all drawn. Giri MVL wasn't too eventful. We had MVL's typical Grunfeld on the board, and Giri seemed to have prepped this bishop d2 line and was looking for a small advantage here. And based on the clocks, it seemed like around here, although the players are still very much in theory, MVL was starting to spend a little bit of time on each move, probably trying to remember his prep or if he had analyzed his position before. Here he plays the thematic move b5, where after white takes on d5, black goes e takes d5, and it's very awkward for white to recapture this pawn, as black is going to be able to create a lot of counterplay in the position. Perhaps starting with bishop b7 or maybe a6 in some positions, trying to get rook e8 check at some point if white's bishop leaves b5. But instead, white plays this move bishop to c4, trying to take back on d5 with the bishop, taking advantage of the fact that black's queen on d6 is hanging and the pawn on d5 is pinned. Now after the moves knight d7, castles, knight b6, I think maybe this was the main moment where white could have gotten a big advantage. Giri plays the move bishop e2, where he ended up not getting a whole lot. After d4, black's point was, in case of c takes d4, to grab this e4 pawn, where black is doing absolutely fine. Instead, white pushed e5, queen d7, and we end up getting an endgame by force here. We'll come back to this. Instead, I think the move bishop to b5 was kind of a stronger choice. And the point here is that if black plays d4 with the same idea of trying to take the e-pawn, white has this move rook ae1, just defending the pawn on e4 and looking for ideas not just to push e5 but also f5, queen h6, and getting some real initiative on the king side. For instance, after rook a d8, c takes d4, c takes d4, and bishop d3, which I think is a really strong move. It's actually going to be very hard for black to find counterplay here with f5 coming, queen h6, and all of white's pieces kind of aimed at the king side. So that was kind of white's one chance to, I think, get some kind of real pressure in the game after d4, e5, cd4, rook a d8, rook a d1, takes, queen takes d4. We end up getting this endgame that, by all accounts, just feels very drosh. Rook d4, takes, rook d3, rook d8, and the players ended up repeating moves very soon, with black's knight coming to c4 and then to b2 and kind of chasing white's rook around. I think white had one opportunity here to play king f2 and perhaps could have posed a few more questions to black here, but after the precise move knight a4 with the idea of bringing the knight to either c3 or c5, I think black gets enough counterplay here to make up for the slightly weakened d4 pawn. So this game soon finished in a draw. The next game I wanted to take a look at is Grischuk versus Wang Hao. These guys played a somewhat theoretical Petrov, where Grischuk goes for this Magnus line with d3 and d4, black goes d5, essentially transposing into an exchange French, bishop d3, bishop d6, and now this move queen e2 check that Magnus played in a couple games a few years ago, one notable one against Caruana. The players followed a pretty theoretical system where white ends up getting the two bishops here and then plays this move c3. I would say in general black was doing quite fine here. And at this moment, Wang Hao makes kind of a strange decision, in my opinion. He probably should have just played the move rook a8, where despite white having the two bishops, I don't feel like white has a really serious advantage here. The structure resembles a French Tarrasch, but black has already traded off the bad light squared bishop, and I think stands pretty solid. It's difficult for white to really put a lot of pressure on this e5 pawn. Wang Hao instead tries to clarify things much quicker and goes cd4, and e5. basically allowing white to trade everything off, and we reach this endgame where white has the 2 bishops, and black is left with this passed pawn on d5, but the passed pawn is also an IQP, an isolated queen pawn, which can often end up pretty weak in these endgames. Now, Grishchik was spending a lot of time after e5, and he spent quite a bit of time on these moves as well, no real surprise there. But the way he plays the game, I think, is quite good. He takes his time, like a good Russian schoolboy. He doesn't hurry here. He slowly improves his position, brings his king to g2. Then he plays bishop d2 here. If black takes the pawn on b2, white will have rook b1, followed by rook takes b7 with a great position. So black instead plays bishop e3, and despite having the 2 bishops, white actually doesn't mind trading one of these off. Rook e6, takes, king f2, rook went back to e6, and now rook to d2. And this game actually really resembled for me the previous round's game, Wang Hao against Giri, where we had a very similar set of pieces, 2 rooks and a bishop versus 2 rooks and a knight, with black having an IQP. And it felt like white had some really serious chances in this game as well. Rook to d1, lining the rooks up against the d-pawn. And now Grishchik just starts pushing g4, starts pushing on the king side. Principle of 2 weaknesses, trying to create some play here. a6, h5. The point being, if g takes h5, white would push g5. The knight would have to move, and white would get these potentially 2 connected passed pawns with f4, and bishop takes h7 coming. Instead, black plays king f7, tries to hold the position. Here, Grishchik plays a3. I think Stockfish was suggesting bishop to b1, threatening this move g5, where if black does not play the move g5, white is just pushing g5 and then winning the d-pawn. Black would probably have to play g5 himself, where after rook e2, for instance, rook e8, rook d1, I think white would have a pretty serious advantage and could continue pushing this for quite some time. As it happened in the game, this is around move 30, so of course Grishchik is in his usual time trouble. He plays a3 here, rook to e8, h takes g6, h takes g6, and he advances forward with g5. And I'm not sure if he missed black's next move. It seems like, based on the time usage, after Wang planted knight e4 check on the board, Grishchik spent most, I think, of his remaining time here and ended up taking bishop takes e4. So black's point, of course, was that f takes e4, de, hits the bishop and also threatens e3, winning the rook. So white is forced to give back the piece, and we ultimately get this pretty equal rook endgame. Grishchik tried bishop takes e4, which I think posed a couple more problems here for black. Rook e1, e takes f3, rook d7 check. And normally when we get 2 rooks on the 7th rank, it can be quite dangerous, but here black just has enough counterplay. So rook h1 was tried, king to g8, and if white tried rook h7, for example, well, the rooks aren't really threatening a whole lot here other than giving a lot of checks. And for instance, after rook c2 takes check and rook f2, black has enough counterplay here to just give checks of his own, eventually trading off one of white's rooks, and the other rook will be active enough to grab the b-pawn at some point. So this would really be nothing special for white. The players played a couple more moves here, but eventually the game ended in a perpetual, with neither side really being able to do anything in this position. So another kind of semi-missed opportunity for Grishchik. He was also doing quite well in his round 1 game against Alexienko, but now standing at 1.5 points, I think he should be quite satisfied with this performance, as he's done reasonably well in all 3 games so far. He was also slightly better against Nepo in round 2 yesterday when he was black. Moving on to the final game of the day, Alexienko versus Nepomniachtchi. Here Jan actually developed a big surprise in the opening with the move e6. I can't recall him playing the French before. Maybe he did in some Blitz and Rapid games, but he's mainly a Sicilian player, specifically a Najdorf player for the most part. But it seems like he's done a lot of work on this lately. In this game he plays the Winter War variation, which is a very sharp line, but a good way to play for the win. And with black against the tournament outsider Alexienko, I definitely think this was a reasonable choice. So the players had a pretty sharp game here. This is one of the typical lines, h4. I think this was popularized by Caruana in recent years, scoring some wins with this move. And the first opening deviation, I would say, came at this moment. Previously, Caruana himself played the move bishop d3 against Anton Smirnov in a Pro Chess League game, trying to induce the move c4 and then backing the bishop up to e2, where since black has kind of closed down the center here, black does not get as much counterplay on the queen side, and white kind of gets a freer hand to develop his initiative on the king side. But Alexienko instead puts the bishop on e2 right away, not forcing black to play c4. I feel like this is slightly worse for white based on the time. He was already spending a couple minutes here on every move, so it's not clear to me whether he was still in his preparation or just kind of improvising at the board. Of course, I don't think he could have expected the French from Nepo in this game. Well, the game continues, I think, a pretty thematic way. Bishop e3, h6, rook a2, knight f5, bishop f4, queen c6, rook b2, and a6. And here Alexienko makes an interesting decision to go d takes c5. Objectively, this one was probably not great, but it actually ends up working out in the game. After some time, Nepo decides to recapture with the queen. I think this was the wrong choice, but probably he was underestimating Kirill's plan in this position. The engine gives b takes c5 and actually says black has a pretty significant edge here. The idea is to go bishop to b5 next, trade off this bad light-squared bishop, and if black is able to achieve this under a comfortable situation, then in the long run white is going to be left with some issues with the a3 and c3 pawns here being just long-term weaknesses. Of course, the dark squared bishop in this position for white is quite a bad piece and is kind of dominated by this knight on f5. Instead, after some time, Nepo decides to play the move queen takes c5, which I think was more of a concrete decision, because he is hitting these pawns now. White is forced to play rook to b4 here, b5, bishop to d3. Now, black doesn't really want to take on c3 at this point. White will go bishop takes f5 and then queen takes d5 with huge initiative. So instead he goes knight to e7, bishop d2, and knight to c6. And maybe this was what Nepo was kind of anticipating, maybe just underestimated white's response. I'm not totally sure here. Because Alexienko just plays a very strong move here, queen e2, just sacrificing the exchange, and he's willing to give up the exchange in order to just take full control over the position. It's much more important for white to not lose the e5 pawn, and of course he probably doesn't want to lose the a3 pawn either. So black takes the rook here. He doesn't really have much of a choice at this point. A takes b4, queen to c7. And here we can kind of see white's point is that this bishop on a4 is really misplaced. It was already kind of a bad piece, but now it's just completely out of the game. And white has tremendous compensation for the exchange here, and I think white already has a very clear advantage. So the game continued, knight d4, knight c6, queen g4, another strong move, takes, and here black goes g6. And this is where Alexienko kind of missed his shot. So everyone was, of course, discussing this move, bishop takes g6. It's the first choice of the engine, so for spectators, it's very easy to find the move when it's the top line. I'm sure he was considering this one during the game, and it's not clear what exactly turned him off to this move. My first guess is that maybe he just didn't like the response castle's queenside. Before we go into that, if f takes g6 here, the idea is queen takes e6 check, queen e7, and now white would have to find the line queen c6 check, king f7, and h5. This is a very important move. I mean, otherwise white is technically a rook down here and could be in trouble. The bishop on a4 is still misplaced, so this is kind of why this is all working for white. And the big point here is after g takes h5, rook e3, white is actually winning with just this monstrous attack with rook f3 coming, rook g3 coming. This is the point of h5 to open up the g file, and black's pieces just can't defend against this initiative. Now, it's possible he just didn't see this line. It is necessary for white to see this whole idea ending with rook to e3. Or perhaps he just didn't like his chances after the move queenside castling, where now white has grabbed this g-pawn, and if black is able to put the rook on g8 here and create this counterplay against the g-file, it could end up kind of bad for white's king. Here the engine finds a very strong idea to go rook to e3. So threatening rook c3, so black is not in time to take on g6, and after something like king b8, white can put the rook on c3 anyway, queen e7, bring the bishop back to d3, And the engine really loves white's chances here, with this rook actually much better placed on c3 compared to e1. On e1, it's really just not doing much except for overprotecting the e5 pawn. But on c3, it can actually activate itself very easily with rook to c6, rook to c5 coming. And here white has tons of compensation for the exchange. Once again, black's bishop on a4 is simply out of the game. Black can't really get much on the g-file here, and white has a pretty significant advantage. Instead, he ends up playing the move h5 here, which also creates some play, but not nearly as enough as bishop takes g6. He might be kicking himself after the game for not taking this chance. And after queen h5, castles f4, we had a pretty sharp position, but it was hard for white to really do anything on the queen side here. He simply tried to stay put. Black got the bishop somewhat back in the game with bishop to c4, rook dg8, king f2, and the game ends up being drawn later on after the moves a5, takes, queen takes f7, queen a2, queen takes e6, queen c2, and now white delivers a perpetual check with queen b6, queen c6, and the players agree to a draw on move 40. So really interesting game, definitely some missed opportunities for both sides. And it'll be interesting to see if Nepo continues to play the French as black later on, or if this was just kind of a one-game surprise where he was, of course, trying to play for the win against the tournament's wildcard. Alright guys, that wraps things up for this video. If you enjoyed the content, please make sure to leave a like/thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already, and make sure to check out Jesse's Move of the Day series, where he breaks down one move, one decision of the most important or intriguing game of the day, and so far he's done a really interesting job, so make sure to check those videos out as well. Tomorrow, Friday, will be a rest day. However, if you're on Twitch, make sure to follow our new channel, ChessDojo Live, where me, Jesse, and International Master David Pruis will be discussing all of the action from the first 3 rounds of the candidates, and that'll be streamed live on air at 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern. So hope to see you guys there. With that, I'll be signing off. Have a great rest of your day, and take care.